we're joined by Mary Rice Hassan, who is the Cato Byrne Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which she co-founded and then directs the Person and Identity Project to educate and equip parents and faith-based institutions to promote the truth about the human person and to counter gender ideology. She's an attorney and policy expert. She and her husband, Seamus Hassan, have 7 grown children and 5 grandchildren? 6 grandchildren. Okay, I have to keep up here. And we welcome Mary and look forward to her talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's my delight, actually, to be the Cato Byrne Senior Fellow at EPPC, named for Phil's mom, who is just a delightful woman. And I'm glad to see her sense of humor carries through to the next generation. So this is an important topic. It's an important topic. So let me just say at the outset, it's a sensitive topic because it's just the whole transgender question is affecting so many families. And we have to understand that there's grief, there's loss, there's pain, even when families are trying to do the right thing, or perhaps especially. But even among those families who have gone down a path suggested by our culture. So we have to have, I think, the heart and mind of the church, loving the individual, but understanding very clearly what is happening in our culture. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. And the reason why is because we love our kids. I take every opportunity to show my grandkids. Just makes me feel like, hey, they're with me. But we care about issues like this, as the Cardinal said, because family matters. Our children, but also the future of the church. The church depends on our children as its future. And we know that we have a special task, that the formation that we give our children has a specific purpose. It's aimed at their eternal destiny. They're created by God, loved by God, called to eternal life with Him. That's our purpose, to assist in that. That's a huge task. The question of identity is very much a part of that, because every person has to answer that essential question, who am I? Because only when you know the answer to that question can you answer the other important questions of life. What's good? What's evil? How should I live? How do I make sense of suffering? Is this all there is? What's my purpose? What happens next? It all comes back to the question of understanding who we are. Now, the church has given us a lot of guidance on that. You know, in Vatican II, the church refers to herself as an expert in humanity because we have the example of Jesus Christ, who is our model, but we have hundreds, thousands of years of thinking, reflecting, being guided by the Holy Spirit to present and to teach an understanding of the human person. I know you know all this, but let me just run through some key points. Because the human person is what is under attack in our culture. And so we have to be able to articulate who we are. Our primary identity is as a son or daughter of the Lord. The most significant thing about you is you were created by God, a God who loves you, keeps you in existence, created you for a purpose, which is eternal love and life with Him. That changes everything. But as we'll see, that's not where our culture is. But our dignity comes from being made in the image and likeness of God. We can't earn it. We can't lose it. We can fail to live in accord with our dignity, but that doesn't strip us of our dignity. A number of years ago, I was at the UN, and there was a session going on that related to human trafficking. And I had the chance to spend some time with a woman who had been trafficked in the Philippines. And one of the things that struck me about her story was that she was duped into leaving her hometown with the promise of education and a job. She got there. She was quickly put into prostitution, drugged up, etc. But one of the things that struck me was she, over time, because of how people treated her, felt like she was not made for anything better. That she was not made for more. That in a sense, this was all she could hope for. And it took the intervention of a Catholic brother and then sisters who, even as she was working the streets, kept coming to her and saying, "You are loved. You have dignity. You are made for more." And she said it was only when suddenly something broke through and she began to believe it. That is what gave her the courage to leave, because they were willing to help her for months, even years, before she actually left. But you get so worn down, she no longer believed that she was made for more. So we have to understand that about ourselves, about relatives or kids who may be wayward. They are made for more. They have that dignity that God gives them. We also know we're made male and female. We're made male and female one for another. God's plan for sexuality, for marriage, for the family is written in our bodies. We have a design, a human nature, a blueprint, which helps us understand the moral law. The moral laws are not arbitrary rules. You know, I read a lot of radical feminist literature and kind of lefty critiques of the church, and they always talk about men in red hats making arbitrary rules, as if, I'm sure you would make really wonderful rules, but that's not the point. They completely miss that God plants in us the natural law in the human heart. And the church, everything the church says, all those moral laws are designed to guide us to live in accord with our nature so that we can truly be happy. That's what they're there for. They're like guardrails. They're like a beacon, a lighthouse. Here's how you get from here to there. It's a completely different understanding of the moral law. We also know we're all broken, we're sinful, but we're redeemed, and we have the power of God's grace and his everlasting mercy. No one is beyond his grace. So that's the Christian vision of who we are. Again, deep down we know it, but we need to be able to articulate it because the world has changed. Right? Even in my parents' generation, which is kind of grandma's world, there was a specific expectation, courtship, love, marriage, children, family, that has been completely not just upended, but blown up, tossed aside, as if it's not only having no relation to human happiness, but is actually an anchor, a weight, something that impedes our finding of happiness. Culture matters. Let me give you two examples that are kind of right here in this local area. Or one is, there's a lawsuit going on right now that the Becket Fund is representing families, Muslim families, Christian families, Catholic families, whose kids attend a Montgomery County school. And they're suing the school district because the school district is no longer allowing them to opt their children out of materials, classes, reading particular books that they find harmful. And you'll see why that matters when I go through what gender ideology actually says. But they're defending their right to be parents against the encroachment of the state. So we can expect that. That's happening. The other case I wanted to tell you about is a case I first became aware of about 3-4 years ago when it was beginning to happen. It's a case of a family out in Indiana who had a good Catholic family, but they had a son who was having some difficulties. And he was in a public school, and a particular counselor or teacher kind of befriended him. He became convinced that he was really a girl, that if he could just live as a girl, that would be the answer to all his struggles. And so he came home one day and he told his parents, or he left them a note saying he was their daughter. He was trans. Parents didn't react very well. Frankly, they were blindsided. They were shocked. Imagine. Because usually in these demands, it's not just I'm trans, it's I'm trans and I want the hormones. I'm trans and I want to be able to, for you to call me she, call me a different name. It's a complete repudiation of everything you've given that child. So the child went back to that school, and the counselor who was advising said, how'd it go? And asked this question, do you feel safe at home? And the child said, no. Not because he was abused, not because his parents did anything wrong, but because they refused to call him by the pronouns he wanted to be called by. The school person called up CPS, mandatory reporting, right? But it was, from my perspective, this is not something the parents have told me particularly, but from my perspective, this was sort of a setup, right? You have the counselor who says, all right, go tell your parents, tell them this, and then come back and tell me, do you feel safe? And as soon as they say, the kid says, I don't feel safe, pick up the phone, call Child Protective Services. That family lost their son, even though the original charges that CPS brought saying that they were abusing their child because they weren't using the pronouns, even though that was rejected by the court said, no, there is no finding of abuse. These are fit parents. And yet they refused to allow them to have custody of their son. And they were worried, rightfully, that they were going to lose the rest of their kids, right? Once you're called an abuser, once you've had your kids taken away, all of a sudden everything is thrown, up for grabs. So this family has a petition before the Supreme Court asking for the court to intervene because the Indiana Supreme Court refused to overturn the lower court hearing that ratified that decision. The family lost custody. These are and this was in Indiana, mind you, not New York, not California, Indiana. Okay, these are the kinds of things that we have to worry about. These are the ramifications of where our culture is. So I want to talk in particular about gender ideology because it's really important that we see and understand exactly what our children are being exposed to. And you may have your kids in the Heights or Oakcrest or, other Catholic schools, and you're a great family. Your kids are still exposed to this through social media, through peers, through their pediatrician, through a counselor, through a coach, through the advertising they see, the sports world. It is everywhere. So let's understand what it's about. I want to focus on three things: the anthropological issue, the harm that it causes, and how it undermines faith. So gender ideology is a belief system. It's a set of ideas, core precepts that you can't challenge. Because if you challenge them, you're being bigoted. You're being intolerant. You're being a transphobe. But these core beliefs form the basis for everything that we're seeing come through society. If you want a more fuller discussion of this, the UN has an independent expert on preventing discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity who has put out numerous reports on gender theory. You can read all about it, but here's the summary. The human person in this ideology is understood as self-creating. There is no room for God in this system, in this belief system. Now, that's an important caveat. In my experience, having spoken with hundreds of people who identify as trans or did identify as trans and then detransitioned, their families, etc., most young people in particular don't look at an ideological list, tick down and say, that's me. And they don't necessarily start out by saying, I reject God. But that's where they will land. Because you cannot ride both horses at once. You cannot hold to the beliefs, the truth about who we are, and embrace this ideology. So it is an atheistic ideology. There is no room for God. Instead, it says, I, as a human being, I am master of my life. I get to define who I am. My body has no meaning. There is no human nature. In fact, I should embrace technology and whatever I can do in order to fulfill my vision for who I am. Feelings decide reality. Sex, marriage, family, all of those are constructions. Well, sex is a thing you do for personal pleasure. Marriage, family are adult constructions to give some benefit, but there's nothing intrinsically good about it, and the meaning has been completely twisted. There's no concept of sin and weakness and the need for grace and healing and forgiveness, but rather, if things are not going right in your life, who's the oppressor in your life? Who's the system that needs to be dismantled? In other words, the fault is always external. I decide what's good. I decide what's true. You can see those images there of the gender unicorn or the genderbread person. They've been around for a good 10 years now, and I've seen them everywhere from State Department documents to college curriculum to med school curricula to kindergarten, pre-K, elementary school materials. It's everywhere. What is it? It's a false vision of the human person, erasing sexual difference, because the body doesn't matter, right? So it's this androgynous image made up of disparate parts, and these parts don't need to align. So it's a fractured vision of the person, whereas we understand the human person as a unity of body and soul. I'm not me without understanding God created me female. I'm his daughter. But in this ideology, all of these different dimensions, each one exists kind of on its own. It doesn't have to match up with anything else. It's a sign, really, of who's behind this. The evil one sows chaos. The evil one sows and hates order, or sows disorder and hates order. This is a disordered understanding of the human person, where the individual says, my feelings decide who I am. That's gender identity. My body, I can change it if I want. I can be attracted or have sexual relations with anyone I choose. My body tells me nothing. There is no good except what I decide that I want. So some key terms. Gender identity has become the concept expressing who the person is. What does gender identity mean? Your self-perception, regardless of your body. The APA defines it as your inner sense of who you are, male, female, both, neither, or something else. You decide how based on your feelings. Unfortunately, gender identity has made its way into the law, and the term sex as an identity is being redefined as being male or female, is being redefined and submerged so that gender identity predominates. I was just looking at some sort of data documents. There are all sorts of organizations across the globe, but in the U.S., particularly concerned with healthcare, that are very invested in making sure that we collect the right data. So the move is to make sure that everyone declares a gender identity from as young as the age of 3, and a sexual orientation from the age of 10. And sex, what they're pushing for is that sex should be relegated to a category of sex for clinical purposes. In other words, you got a problem with gender ideology, right? Because our bodies are real. And when you're dealing with medicine, you have to understand something about the human body. Is this a male person, a female person? One of the advances of medicine in the past 15, 20, 25 years has been the recognition that male and female bodies are different, so that our symptoms are different. For example, of heart attacks. Medicine interacts with the female body differently than it might interact with the male body. Sexual difference matters in health. But here, according to this belief system, sex is minimized. And it's done in 2 ways. One, by calling it just a label. You know that male or female you have on your birth certificate? Merely a label. You don't like it? You can change it. In fact, it used to be in every state of the Union, you could simply change your birth record, the sex on your birth record. Now, states are beginning to realize that was a huge mistake to go in that direction. They were persuaded to do that by kind of the sympathy card. Oh my gosh, there's like 5 people who identify as transgender who their licenses and birth certificates don't match who they know themselves to be. And sympathetic legislators said, it's 5 people. Sure, you can change. And now we have this mass corruption of the meaning of sex. And now states are pushing back. So sex is now understood as sex assigned at birth. That's a term Catholics should never use. Our sex is not assigned at birth. Our sex is who we are. It's determined at conception. It's immutable. It cannot change. It's not an arbitrary label. But under this telling, particularly in children's books, here's how it goes. When you were born, the doctor took a look at your body and made a guess as to who you are. But only you know for sure. So if you don't like that label on your birth certificate, you don't like that name, you can get rid of it and choose a new one. So that's one way of minimizing sex. The other way is to talk about people as if we're these parts that just happen to sort of fall into a certain configuration for us, but might not be true of others. So, for example, I know of a couple of med schools where they're teaching residents, because they've gotten money from transgender-identified philanthropists or from foundations that are pushing this, they're teaching med students that when a person comes in, they sit down, the patient, you say, "Who are you?" And they tell you their gender identity, how they identify. "I'm genderqueer." Great, that's who you are. But now you've got a problem, right? Because you're a doctor, you still got to know something about their body. But you can't presume that if this obviously male person sitting in front of you is an obviously male person, that he has male genitalia, male gonads, etc. You can't presume that. Instead, you have to tick down an anatomical inventory and ask what parts you have. So you will ask this obvious male in front of you with a straight face, "Do you have a uterus?" And the next breath, "Do you have testicles?" As if that's even possible. But in this imaginary world, magical thinking, you can be who you want to be. If you don't like your parts, you can get rid of them. You can replace them. So Catholics, in my view, should not use the term gender identity. Many people use gender as a synonym for sex, and particularly in other languages, people got used to that. We can't, because it's being corrupted in law and in culture. When you say gender, people understand it to mean your self-defined identity. You have to be specific. And speaking to your children, we have to teach them the reality of sex. So what we have is a clash of anthropologies. Two completely different, irreconcilable visions of the human person. And whatever used to be true in the past, today, gender ideology is the reigning anthropology within our culture. And so what does that mean? Well, every culture catechizes its youth in its basic beliefs about what it means to be a human being. But we no longer, as a culture, are teaching our kids you're male or female and about the family. Instead, our children are exposed, and this is what the issue was in Montgomery County, are exposed to materials that from the youngest ages tell them, you decide. Who you are is who you feel yourself to be. And so reinforcing those concepts that they are autonomous individuals, reality is theirs to define, feelings rule, the body has no meaning. We see it at all levels, and we see the confusion that results. The two individuals on the bottom are both females who identify as males. I took those from a screenshot from a pride parade. And they truly believe they can create themselves. I'm self-made. Why? Because I take hormones. Because I've rejected the givenness of my body, my sexual identity as male or female. I decide who I am. Again, this is what our children are surrounded by. And we adults, people who've grown up when there was still sort of a firm basis in truth in our culture, even though the sexual revolution was ravaging the culture, most people and most of our institutions until about 10, 15 years ago still basically adhered to the truth, at least implicitly. But that's no longer the case. So we see it in the numbers. There was a survey that just came out by PRRI. It's a survey company particularly focused on religion that found 28% of Gen Z adults 18 to 25 identify as members of the LGBTQ community. In that generation, the percentage of Catholics is about 14%. The projections I've seen are that within 10 years, you will have a third of that generation who are voters identifying as LGBTQ. What does that do to a culture when people have bought into an ideology that denies the truth about the person, that believes there is no truth to the idea of family, but rather we choose our families, we define them as we desire? Equally troubling, perhaps more troubling, is the percentage of young people who are identifying as transgender or gender diverse. The stat that's highlighted there, the 9.2%, comes from a study of Pittsburgh high schoolers. And it was a well-done study, and they found 9.2% identified as trans or gender diverse. That's just an umbrella term. Maybe they gender queer or something. The common denominator of any of these identity labels that fall under that transgender umbrella is a rejection of your given sexual identity. It almost doesn't matter where you land, because once you've rejected the truth that you're male or female, you're going to go through a number of iterations. In fact, I've seen studies that say between 2 and 4 different identities are what the average person who begins to identify as trans expresses. And they explain that as, well, that's just your gender journey, instead of realizing, no, when you pull up the anchor and you're being tossed about on a rough sea, you're going to bob in all different directions. And so once you toss out and pull up the anchor from being rooted in the truth of who you are, male or female, you're going to be tossed about by the culture and by your own feelings, trying to figure out who you are. Now, that 9.2% came from Pittsburgh, which some people say, that's urban. Can't possibly be that in like Oklahoma or West Virginia. Same clinicians, same researchers did a parallel study of kids in rural areas. And it was a little bit lower, 7.2%. Astonishingly high. For perspective, in 2013, the DSM that was published in 2013 recorded the percentage of people who identified as transgender as 0.002% of the population. So this is the product of culture. And we see that too just by looking at the Gen Z versus Boomer numbers of identification as LGBTQ. This is not, some people say, it's just because we're freer as a culture. We're free now. We can all just say who we are. If that were true, you would have people throwing off the shackles at all ages. But that's not what we see. Even across the globe, this is a youth phenomenon. It is driven by culture. It's driven by ideology. So, if it were just about ideas, you'd say, we'll fight this on the level of ideas, and we'll win, we'll prove the truth is right. But I'll tell you what, in the meantime, people are getting hurt. And that's the other thing that we need to realize, is that having lost sight of the truth, we lose sight of what's good. And we see that in the APA proceedings as they began to change the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. Back in the 60s, if you talked about this phenomenon of someone's feelings not matching the physical reality of their body, people wrote about it in research papers as delusion, as a clinical term, meaning you have a fixed belief in something that's impossible. And that was called and understood to be mental illness. Over time, that was softened. People became concerned. We're stigmatizing people. We're pathologizing people. So it became gender identity disorder. And then eventually, in 2013, they took out the language of disorder and said, nothing to see here, folks. This is perfectly normal. This is a normal human variant. That phrase, gender dysphoria, that we hear so much about, was a compromised diagnosis. Why? Because once you say it's perfectly normal for a person's feelings, their perception of themselves, not to match the physical reality, if you say that's perfectly normal, well then it's like, what are you doing in the doctor's office? What do you need from us? People who identify as transgender and want to transition want hormones. They want bodily interventions. They want surgeries. Not all of them, but that's sort of the expectation. And to get that covered by insurance, you need a diagnostic code. So the compromise was, we're going to say you're perfectly normal, but gender dysphoria, distress, if it's clinical distress, we'll keep that in. We'll give you your diagnostic code. Therefore, you get this paid for by insurance. On the global stage, they're getting rid of even that concept of gender dysphoria and distress, saying lots of trans people are perfectly happy. They're not distressed, but they have a human right to get these body modifications. So the World Health Organization, in its catalog of diseases, calls it simply gender incongruence. You just have this experience that your feelings don't match your body. Again, nothing to see here. It's a matter of sexual health. Whatever aids you need, you can have. So, again, what's the significance of that? When you lose sight of the truth, you lose sight of what's good. And when you lose sight of what's good, when someone who's troubled comes to see you, you aren't allowed to take a position. And that's what's happened in psychology. Where someone comes in and is experiencing this, you're not allowed to say, well, let me help you figure out what's going on so that you can integrate your feelings, your self-perception with the reality of your body. You're not allowed to say that. You have to, at best, be sort of agnostic. Maybe your path is to, quote, be transgender, or maybe your path is something else. That's at best. Okay? Having lost sight of the truth, we lose sight of what's good. So what have we seen? As medicine has leaned into this, in other words, technology has made it profitable for us to alter people's bodies. And we've lost our Christian roots. Ideology has made it palatable to accept these ideas. We have seen just a huge spike in young people identifying as transgender, but in particular being diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And whereas we've always had a very small percentage of people who experience this kind of disconnect, again, that 0.002%, it was usually adult males or very young children. And very young children, it's often rooted in either a trauma or something going wrong in their immediate environment or their relationships, loss of a loved one, something. Adult males, it's more appears, there are a couple of different theories, but one is there's a sexual fetish involved, etc. What we've seen in the past 15 years is something entirely different. Adolescents and young adults is what is driving the spike in people identifying as transgender or seeking to transition. And it's shifted. It's not mostly males. Now it's 2-to-1 females. So how does someone know? Well, again, once you're agnostic about what's good and you say feelings define reality, what do? Kid comes in, they say, this is how I feel. You just ask them, are you trans? How do you identify? This doctor on the left, I snapped that from a video where he was explaining parents, when they bring a kid in, will say, how do I know my kid is trans? And he says, well, I just turn, look at the kid, I ask him, who are you? They know who they are. That's the claim. As if the body tells us nothing. As if there is no truth but what's given by their feelings. We don't do that about anything else, do we? Right? Someone who comes in who's anorexic and says, I really need to go on a diet or get liposuction. We don't do it, right? Feelings don't match reality. We don't put young people in charge of making momentous decisions because we know they are immature and they do not perceive reality oftentimes correctly. It's really tremendously important for us as parents to realize this is a continuum. Once someone begins to identify as transgender, once they are rejecting their given male or female sexual identity, if you start to validate that belief, you are putting them on the trans conveyor belt. You're putting them on the trans train. It's very easy to get on, very difficult to get off. Because statistically now, after about 10 years with some studies, we've seen the numbers. It used to be said that if you just validate someone's self-perceived identity, you're giving them time and space to figure out who they are. That it's sort of a neutral intervention. It's not neutral. Why? Because you're confirming that false belief. You're treating them as if that's true. And many of the detransitioners, or some of them that I've spoken to, have said, people underestimate when a kid is coming out and saying, I'm trans, or I'm not your son, I'm your daughter, whatever. They underestimate how much ambivalence there is, how much confusion is in that child's heart. And so they think, this must be it. This is going to solve my problems, make my pain go away, make me feel like I fit in and I belong somewhere. And so they come out with this pronouncement. But they're looking and they're measuring the adults in the room. If they accept that as true, if they validate that, it's like confirmation. I really did get it right. And so teachers, counselors, doctors, experts, whoever, the favorite aunt who decides the way to love someone who's experienced this distress over their identity or body is to go with them. To validate that belief is doing harm, because you're validating the false belief and pushing them onto a path that is very, very difficult, very hard to get off of. So it's important for us to realize there are no, quote, trans kids. This idea of social transition is, again, pitched as being, at least they're not taking hormones, they're not doing anything to their body. They're living as if, they're living a lie. They're living as if something that's true is not true, as if they can recreate reality. But that has its own confirming potential. They tend to persist. In fact, overwhelmingly persist. Same thing with puberty suppression, which was started here in the U.S. in 2007. It was billed then as giving kids time, a pause. No distress about puberty, as if puberty is a disease. You don't have to worry. You can figure out who you are. We're just going to stop the natural, healthy development of your pubertal growth to give you time. It's completely reversible. It's not completely reversible because you never get that time back. And people are not just bodies that are either going to grow facial hair or not. They're whole persons. You can't get that back. You're reinforcing a belief that they are someone they're not. And we know now that there are significant health problems, from bone demineralization to all sorts of unknown issues with the brain. Some studies have come out recently pointing out to IQ drop when someone's on puberty blockers. All these things, these were questions that were known to the original Dutch researchers, that these could potentially, because puberty is a whole body process, these could be some of the consequences. They didn't care. They didn't do any studies. They didn't let that pause their agenda to say everyone's got a right to decide who they are. So there are serious ramifications with puberty suppression. One of the biggest ones is that puberty suppression, that keeps you immature, when you introduce cross-sex hormones on top of that, you're almost always going to be sterile. Why? Because you've never matured in your own sex, and now you're putting this flood of cross-sex hormones that are going to break down your normal system. New research that just came out in the past 2 weeks from Germany. They did a substantive evidence review building on a similar one that was done in the UK a couple of years ago to see if the claim that using puberty suppression produced mental health benefits, to see if that was true. And this was a well-done study, and they said, no benefit. So when you hear that, and I've been watching because the news media just studiously ignores all the research that's coming out to disprove their claims, you will still hear great mental health benefits, reduces depression, reduces anxiety, reduces gender dysphoria. It is not true. And this is coming out, again, of gender clinics that don't buy into our our anthropology. They're still aligned with the ideology, but they have to confront the data. They have to confront what they're seeing clinically, that kids are not improving. Same thing with cross-sex hormones. Similar studies, the German study also addressed this. Cross-sex hormones perpetuate the lie, right? They'll cause cosmetic changes. You can get facial hair. If you're a boy, you might get breast growth. They can't turn you into the opposite sex. You can't put a girl on testosterone and think she's going to start to make sperm. She never is going to. All that's going to do is break her own system. But it's interesting, the language that's used in the informed consent documents of gender clinics. They talk about these medications as masculinizing and feminizing the body. Sex binary, anyone? Right? That's all they can do, is masculinize or feminize. There are only two sexes. They're just trying to rewrite the rules. And then, of course, surgery for, unfortunately, a number of young people go down that route. The youngest age that we know of genital surgery being done on boys is 15. Top surgery for girls, which is a euphemism, which means double amputation of the breasts, double mastectomy, is 13. Think back to when you were 13, or maybe you've got 13-year-olds. You don't trust them with any momentous decision, much less the idea that you can just get rid of body parts you're uncomfortable with. So surgery is definitely done on kids. WPATH, which is the transgender organization, it's an activist organization that kind of masquerades as a health organization. They put out what they called standards of care that don't meet any of the criteria for true standards of care. In 2022, they removed all their minimum ages for any of these interventions. Why? Because they didn't want to have a bottom age that would then create a floor that if someone went below it would open them up to a lawsuit. So, you need to know, when someone says, like our Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services, Rachel Levine, when someone says that gender-affirming interventions are life-saving or they prevent suicide, it's not true. And again, new research just came out in the past few weeks from Finland, which, again, socialized medicine, they keep meticulous records. Unlike here, it's kind of the Wild West. You have to go clinic by clinic to get data. What they found was that over a 6-year follow-up, which is not tremendously long, but much longer than the junk research that will say, oh, great effects after 3 months, what they found is that any suicide risk is fully explained by the pre-existing mental health issues that are present in those kids or young adults. In other words, someone who's struggling with their identity or their body, they're hating their body, they're in pain. Something's going on. But our problem is we stop trying to figure out what and trying to find how to heal. And instead, we said, we know what to do. It's just because you're born in the wrong body. Here, go down this transition path. And so what they found was, nope, the suicidality, actually, completed suicides is very low. It's higher than kids with no issues, as you might expect. But it's completely consistent with the population of young people who have mental health issues. Okay, so it's not the case that if you don't transition a kid, you're going to end up with a dead kid. And that, in such stark terms, is what many clinicians have used to manipulate parents who love their kids and are just trying to figure out how to help them. They give them that false choice, transition or your kid's going to die. We know from longer-term research on adults that gender transitions do not bring happiness. And again, they don't prevent suicide. This top study is a study that was done where they actually tracked suicidality through the transition process. And they found people committed suicide all through the transition process. And the average time for those who took their own lives was 6 years after they began the transition process. In my own experience, I've known, unfortunately, 2 young people who have taken their lives. And both of them, 5, 6, 7 years. They were both had families that were kind of championing them, etc. But what happens is when you start going down that path and you believe that's the answer to your problems, you never address the underlying mental health issues. And they don't go away. They're just masked for a while, but they don't go away. And sooner or later, the glow wears off, your body's starting to break down under the influence of hormones or surgery, and you have to face the fact it doesn't feel good. So we can see in research from other countries that the typical young person and adult who might be diagnosed with gender dysphoria has experienced trauma, high rates of adverse childhood experiences. Remember, that doesn't mean you as parents are at fault. It just means something went wrong. That kid had a really difficult experience that maybe they haven't processed or they don't know how to make sense of it. In other words, people have wounds. And so the wounds are very real, and that's what we see in the backgrounds of young people and young adults who are identifying as transgender. We also benefit from the testimony of detransitioners. We're now seeing hundreds of these young people who were pushed down this transgender path, who, for a variety of reasons, realized, I can't change sex. Oh my gosh, what have I done? And have reclaimed their identities. And this young woman in particular, Chloe Cole, is courageous. If you have young kids, teenagers, if they have not listened to the testimony of detransitioners, you need to bring those testimonies to them. Because they need to hear, in the words of their peers, the kinds of feelings they experienced that led them to go down this path, the things they believed, and then what they discovered. It's tremendously powerful. Young people are persuaded by stories, and there's plenty of them out there. We've also seen a change in trajectory in Europe. There are now 6 countries that have decided to either limit or effectively ban, restrict to only clinical trials, any use of medical or surgical interventions in minors. No puberty suppression, no cross-sex hormones. Why? Again, not because they became believers in the truth and discovered the reality of anthropology, but because they started looking at the data and they were honest scientists. And they said, something's not right here. We are not helping people. In fact, we're not seeing the benefits, but we're also seeing huge risks. Kids who are sterilized at the age of 14, 15, continuing mental health problems, bodies that are breaking down, etc. So that is a tremendous fact. It should be a game changer. Unfortunately, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Endocrine Society, who have put out 2 of the guidelines that pertain to this, have said, oh, okay, we'll review the evidence. But they also said, because we don't like what's going on in the States where they're trying to restrict this. So they have their thumb on the scale. They want to keep things as it is. I think what's going to change will be the lawsuits. And there are now about a dozen lawsuits from detransitioners against 1, and maybe 2, against the American Academy of Pediatrics, specific gender clinicians, hospitals, counselors, even teachers. So again, we need to do what's true. It's an unfortunate fact that where you live is going to affect how this plays out for your kids. The states that are in blue are the ones that have embraced gender ideology. Gender ideology is a problem across the country. But those states in particular are aggressively trying to separate kids from their parents by empowering kids to make these decisions as minors. Minors as young as, again, 14, 15 years of age. And then keeping parents in the dark in terms of what's happening in the schools. So what impact does this have on faith? You might say, well, my kid knows who they are. They're not troubled by this. They see what's going on. It affects their faith. It has to affect their faith because they are pressured from every side to believe that loving someone means you validate whoever they say they are, that even if you don't go along with this, well, you can be an ally, but what's required of an ally is basically validating, endorsing, etc. So they're pushed in a peer pressure kind of way, but also even within the faith, there are people who are saying, no, this is compassionate, welcome, inclusion, come on in. We're all for that. The Lord wants everyone in his church. The big question is, then what? Do we help them live according to the truth, to find what's good, or do we simply validate their desires as if that's going to lead to happiness? Unfortunately, the other message our kids are hearing is that the LGBTQ population is a kind of persecuted or stigmatized population, and religion is the enemy. They are hearing that narrative in 1,000 different ways. From advertising, from peers, from government folks, from in their schools, even from people within the faith, unfortunately. So it's important to be specific. What do you do, okay, in the face of all this? Be specific. The church loves everyone. When God gives us his plan, it's not because it's arbitrary. It's because he knows us better than we do. He created us. There is a design to our body. Even a kid who's rejecting God can see there's a design. And that's where several of the popes have talked about human ecology. We know if you put chlorine in a stream, you're going to kill the fish. Well, our bodies have a design. You have to treat them according to their design, or you break things. You pollute things. You harm things. So we need to be very clear. The church does not teach that someone who's struggling is somehow immoral or evil. The church says, we're here to help. But part of helping is to help you see the truth, to help you find healing for whatever is going on underneath the surface. So I'm not going to go through all the teachings, but just realize the church has said plenty about this. If you want a list, personidentity.com, which is the website I have. We have a resources tab. I think we've collected everything the church or church leaders have said on this. So it's very clear, the truth about who we are. The church cares about this too, because even the best kid is going to be less receptive to catechesis, to the truth, to the extent they're taking on board the beliefs of gender ideology. So it undermines catechesis. Resurrection of the body. What does that even mean if your body has no meaning? Maybe it's not your body. Maybe it's the wrong body. What does the incarnation mean? Jesus becoming man. If you kind of self-identify into those categories and there is no truth about who you are. Okay, all of these concepts, not to mention marriage, sexuality, etc., are thrown into question by this ideology. So practically speaking, 3 Ps. You need to be proactive, protective, and then personal. Proactive means you don't even have to talk about gender ideology, but you have to make sure your kids are hearing over and over at different ages, not just from you, but from other adults, the truth about who they are, the goodness of being created male or female, the rightness of living in accord with your nature. They need to hear the truth. Being proactive also means strengthening your relationships with your kids today. As a mom of 7, I can tell you there is always something you can do to strengthen those relationships. And if you have a kid who's going through a hard time, they need your attention, not to focus on that problem, but to help them understand you love them, you care about them, and you simply want to spend time with them. To build that relationship. That's being proactive. Again, you're not even talking about gender ideology. The other aspect of being proactive is tend to physical health, right? Because we know in young people, depression, anxiety, all these things are more likely to occur when someone is not sleeping enough, not eating right, and not exercising. So to the extent you help kids live healthy lives, you're creating a little bit of natural resistance. Protective. That's where you have to address gender ideology. If you were sending your kids, a new driver, out onto a tricky country road that's got, ditches on either side and holes in the middle, you would tell them what to expect. You would tell them where the danger spots are. We need to tell our kids that, yes, they may be misguided, but there are people who are proposing things that are lies. There are people who believe a completely different vision of the human person, and we pray for them and we want to bring them in and help them see the truth, but you have to recognize the lie. They need to hear from you, not just that there are lies out there or that's a lie. They need to understand why. So you have to be able to engage them in conversation or bring someone else in who can answer those questions. But we have to equip our kids to understand what that tsunami that's hitting youth culture is trying to drag them out to. Being protective also means setting wise boundaries, whether it's in friends, social media, who kids are spending time with. I was speaking to a friend who was telling me that their son had befriended the son of a same-sex couple, and the family had another kid that was identifying as trans, and their own son was trying to be kind and now was befriending this kid and was getting invitations to go over to that house. And the mom was saying, I want him to be a good friend. I want him to be loving. And it's like, that's great. But you know what? You as a parent, your first obligation is to protect your child. And there is an element of social contagion, especially when kids are empathetic. Kids have hearts for their friend who's suffering. And they want to identify. They want to understand. That pulls them into closer proximity. And unfortunately, if a kid's got vulnerabilities or wounds, those wounds are just going to pull them in the wrong direction. You have to be willing to set boundaries. It means being wise about that. With younger kids, you can just fill their dance cards so they're doing something else, and you never have to say, we're not playing with Johnny, or we're not going to be in that situation. We're not going to the drag queen story hour. With older kids, just in case it was an issue, with older kids, you need to be more creative. You need to engage their critical thinking, asking them, what's good? What do you see? Help them to buy into what you're putting in front of them. But when all else fails, you have to be willing to make decisions. I know families who have had kids who've been caught up in the whole transgender thing, who have literally moved across the country. I know one family that left the country. In most cases, it's a matter of changing a school or changing a friend group or helping the child regain a fuller sense of life. Most kids who fall into this pit, their world quickly narrows. There's nothing else but the cause. Everything is about LGBTQ. They stop swimming, they stop running, they stop doing dance, whatever it might be. So helping them expand their world so that gender is not the obsessive thing in front of them. So being protective, and then personal. When you have a young person who comes to you and says, this is what I'm experiencing, or this is who I am, lead with love. The first thing out of your mouth has to be, I love you. I'm here for you. I'm in this with you for the long haul. We'll figure it out together. They need to hear that. The second thing you need to do is you have to ask questions. Because a kid who says, I'm trans, or non-binary, that's the big one for girls, I'm non-binary. You need to figure out, is this something they've been thinking about for 3 years and they've got 5 friends who are also non-binary? Or is it something they just saw on YouTube and they thought, I don't fit those stereotypes, that's me. You need to know the difference. You only will figure that out by asking questions, open-ended questions. Tell me, I'd like to understand. What led you to this place? What were you reading? What were you thinking about? I want to understand. So you listen and you take it in, and don't be afraid to pause the conversation. Because kids who are in this place tend to want to push things down. They want that locomotive going in the direction that they believe is right for them, and that their online cheerleaders or cheerleaders at school are telling them they must do now. So you have to slow it down. You need to listen. You need to tell them, we're going to work on this, but it's going to take some time. But then you have to be willing to guide, and you have to be willing to act. Because in the end, that's your responsibility. You are their parents. No one loves them like you do. So you are the ones that God has given the grace to be able to guide them. So have confidence in that. We have to address same-sex attraction. About 2/3 of kids who experience troubles with identity have previously struggled with same-sex attraction. I know I'm running up on time, but 2 things to know here are, it is really toxic when kids self-label, I'm gay, or when other kids label them. Because we know that sexual attraction can change. It's fluid really until about mid-20s, sometimes older. Kids can misinterpret an experience, maybe that they have with a peer or an older person or something. Okay, so you have to sort those things out, but resist the temptation to just say, well, I got a gay kid. You don't have a gay kid any more than you have a trans kid. You have a young person who has particular struggles, strengths, and weaknesses, and you have to help them live in accord with God's plan for them. So beware of social media and the experts in your lives who are going to push them down the path. I don't have time to go through all of that, but let me just leave you with this. Some of you may have seen this video that came out 2 years ago by the Gay Men's Health Chorus. They put out a video. It was actually a performance they had done numerous times in San Francisco and other places where they had this song, "We're coming for your children. We're coming for your children." And when some conservative commentator found it and posted it, and there was a huge backlash, they said, no, this was just kind of tongue-in-cheek. It's not tongue-in-cheek. Okay, I don't know about these particular individuals, but I will tell you, the ideologues, those who are pushing this ideology are coming for your children. Because they believe that to be a human being means you get to decide whatever you want. And that anyone who restricts that is causing harm. So we need to do better. We need to accompany, but towards a purpose, towards the truth, towards what's good. And only then will our kids be able to really embrace the truth about who they are. They're beautifully and wonderfully made. They need to hear that from us so that they can become the young men and young women God created them to be. Thank you.